The early morning light of March 3, 1943, broke across the Bismarck Sea with deceptive tranquility, the kind of dawn that seemed to promise nothing more than another day of war in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada stood on the destroyer Shirayuki's deck, his fingers wrapped around the cold metal railing, watching as the eastern horizon began to reveal shapes that would transform his understanding of naval warfare forever. What emerged from the distance was not a typical squadron of enemy aircraft, but an approaching swarm so vast that it seemed to defy every calculation of air power that Japanese military doctrine had established. The sheer number of incoming planes created a darkness against the morning sky, as if the enemy had somehow managed to mobilize every aircraft in the entire theater for this single engagement. His hands shook as he held onto the rail, not from fear alone, but from the recognition that what he was witnessing contradicted everything he had been taught at the Naval Academy. Years later, when divers recovered his waterlogged diary from the depths near Goodenough Island, historians would read his final observations before the battle commenced. Through the bridge windows of his vessel, Yamada observed American bombers executing maneuvers that seemed impossible according to every tactical manual he had studied. These twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers descended to altitudes so low that their propellers were actually churning white spray from the ocean surface itself. The aircraft had been modified in ways that seemed to violate the very purpose of medium bombers, bristling with forward-mounted weapons that transformed them into something entirely unprecedented. In the rigid structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such radical modifications to standard aircraft would have required endless committee approvals, countless forms signed by multiple departments, and years of cautious testing before even a prototype could be authorized. Yet somehow, the Americans had taken their standard medium bombers and converted them into specialized ship-killing weapons in a matter of weeks, demonstrating a flexibility and innovative spirit that the Japanese military system simply could not comprehend. Packed into the holds and crowded onto the decks of 8 transport ships were nearly 7,000 soldiers from the 51st Division, young men who had boarded with confidence that their powerful destroyer escort would ensure safe passage to the shores of New Guinea. The mathematics of their destruction would be calculated not in the comfortable confines of planning rooms by staff officers with charts and compasses, but in the split-second timing and brutal efficiency of skip-bombing attacks that would sink more Japanese vessels in a quarter hour than submarines had managed to destroy over many months of patient stalking. This transformation in aerial warfare capability had not happened overnight, but rather had begun its gestation period approximately 5 months earlier, back in October of 1942, when an innovative officer named Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, who had previously served with the Navy before transferring to the Army Air Forces, proposed a modification concept that violated virtually every established principle of bomber aircraft design. His proposal was radical in its simplicity. Strip out the entire bombardier compartment from the nose of the B-25, remove the complicated bombsight equipment and the position for the bombardier himself, and replace all of that with 8.50 caliber machine guns mounted to fire straight ahead. The concept would transform a vulnerable medium bomber into an aggressive strafing platform that could suppress defensive fire from ships while simultaneously delivering bombs at masthead height. When Gunn first presented his idea to superior officers, many dismissed it as the fantasy of someone who had spent too long in the tropical sun. They called his proposal madness, a waste of valuable aircraft and resources. However, General George Kenney, who commanded the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized the concept as something quite different. Pure genius, born of desperate necessity. Among the Japanese convoy vessels steaming through the Bismarck Sea that morning was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who commanded the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla from his flagship Shirayuki. Kimura's personal history was one of steady competence overcoming initial mediocrity, as he had graduated 107th out of 118 cadets from the Imperial Naval Academy, but had gradually risen through the ranks purely through demonstrated skill in destroyer operations. His flotilla of 8 destroyers provided escort for the vital reinforcement convoy, which consisted of multiple transport vessels: Ayamaru, Kembu-maru, Kyokusei-maru, Oigawa-maru, Shinai-maru, Taimei-maru, Teiyo-maru, along with the Navy transport Nojima. Each of these vessels was loaded far beyond normal capacity, with soldiers, crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, and the desperate hopes of maintaining Japanese territorial positions throughout New Guinea. Kimura had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor as the captain of the cruiser Suzuya, had helped coordinate rescue operations after the devastating defeat at Midway, and had earned genuine respect throughout the entire fleet for his tactical handling of destroyer formations. Despite all this experience across multiple major engagements of the Pacific War, absolutely nothing had prepared him for what American ingenuity had created in the improvised workshops and jungle airfields around Port Moresby. The journey from innovative concept to actual annihilation capability had taken place in the humid, primitive workshops of northern Australia, where aircraft mechanics hammered sheets of aluminum into new shapes by hand, creating replacement nose sections for B-25 bombers without access to proper factory tools or adequate facilities. These men worked through the tropical nights by the flickering light of kerosene lamps, modifying aircraft in ways that engineers back at Boeing's factories would have considered not just difficult but genuinely impossible given the available resources. Each modification underwent testing flights over the wreck of the SS Pruth, a merchant vessel that had run aground back in 1923 and now served as convenient target practice for developing this new form of warfare. Pilots pushed their modified bombers lower and lower with each practice run, first down to 50 feet above the waves, then to 20 feet, eventually reaching altitudes of just 10 feet above the ocean surface, learning through terrifying trial and error that occasionally ended in crashes how to skip 500-pound bombs across water using the same physics that children employed when skipping flat stones across calm ponds. On February 28, 1943, at Simpson Harbour near Rabaul, the loading of the convoy proceeded with the characteristic efficiency that Japanese military operations typically demonstrated. Soldiers from the 51st Division filed aboard the transport ships in orderly columns, each man carrying his rifle and pack, climbing gangways while officers checked manifests. Among these soldiers was Private First Class Kenji Matsumoto, whose letters home would eventually be discovered floating in an oil-stained canvas bag several weeks after the battle. In one of his final letters to his mother, Matsumoto described with genuine admiration the magnificent sight of the destroyer escort, 8 sleek warships that were veterans of virtually every major engagement since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Surely, he wrote with confidence, nothing could possibly threaten such powerful protection. His letter described in detail the stacked rifles on deck, the machine gun positions that had been hastily welded to the transport ship railings, and the confident assurances from officers who repeatedly told the enlisted men that American bombers simply could not hit moving ships with any meaningful accuracy. Japanese Navy planners had calculated that acceptable losses for this convoy operation would be approximately 40% of the transports, considering this level of attrition reasonable if even half the troops managed to reach Leh and reinforce the garrison there. What Admiral Kimura and his staff did not know, could not have known through any conventional reconnaissance, was that American codebreakers stationed in Melbourne and Washington had been systematically reading Japanese naval communications for weeks. Every single detail of the convoy's composition, its planned route, its timing, and its destination flowed across Allied intelligence desks before the first soldier had even set foot on the gangway. Even more devastating from the Japanese perspective was that the Americans had not merely been planning, but had been conducting extensive, dangerous practice sessions. These were not theoretical exercises conducted in comfortable briefing rooms with officers moving markers around maps, but desperate, genuinely dangerous rehearsals where B-25 bombers slammed through the blast waves of their own exploding bombs, where pilots learned through painful experience to release their ordnance at precisely the correct instant to achieve the perfect skip trajectory that would carry the bomb into the target vessel's hull. Lieutenant Colonel John Hennebury of the 3rd Bomb Group had actually crashed one Mitchell bomber directly into the mast of the practice wreck during training. Another aircraft had been so severely damaged by flying debris during a practice run that it barely managed to limp back to base, the crew shaken but wiser about the dangers of flying through their own explosions. The initial contact with the convoy occurred on March 1st, when a patrolling B-24 Liberator on routine reconnaissance spotted the Japanese ships through a temporary break in the storm clouds that had been providing natural concealment for the Japanese movement. The pilot counted 8 transports and 8 destroyers, exactly matching what intelligence reports had predicted, moving at 7 knots through heavy seas that caused the transports to roll heavily. The first attacks came from high-flying B-17 flying fortresses, and these initial bombing runs achieved precisely what Japanese commanders expected based on their experience: minimal damage despite dozens of bombs being dropped from altitude. The high-altitude bombing technique that American forces had been using throughout much of the war proved largely ineffective against moving ships, with bombs falling harmlessly into the ocean around the vessels. However, one transport, the Kyokusei Maru, took a direct hit during these initial attacks and broke completely in half, its cargo of ammunition and fuel drums creating a massive pillar of fire and black smoke visible for 20 miles in every direction. Despite this loss, 7 transports remained afloat and operational, and Japanese confidence in their defensive measures held firm. The destroyer escorts had performed exactly as doctrine prescribed, maneuvering aggressively and laying smoke screens while filling the sky with anti-aircraft fire. That night, as the convoy regrouped in the darkness and destroyer crews worked to pull survivors from the oil-slicked waters where the Kyokusei Maru had gone down, Admiral Kimura faced an important tactical decision. Rather than pushing through to reach Leh under the relative safety of darkness, he decided to delay the convoy's arrival until dawn, reasoning that daylight would allow for much easier and more efficient unloading of the troops and cargo once they reached port. The weather patterns seemed to be clearing, but Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported no unusual Allied air activity that would suggest a major attack was being prepared. The Admiral and his staff agreed that spending one additional night at sea posed minimal risk, certainly less than attempting to navigate unfamiliar waters and conduct complex unloading operations in complete darkness. What they had utterly failed to detect was the fevered level of preparation taking place at Port Moresby and surrounding airfields, where ground crews worked straight through the night loading bombs and ammunition, fueling aircraft and conducting final mechanical checks on every plane that would participate in the coming assault. March 2nd brought scattered attacks that seemed to confirm all of the Japanese assumptions about American bombing capabilities. B-17s continued to drop their bombs from 10,000 feet, their accuracy significantly hampered by both the intense anti-aircraft fire and the evasive maneuvering that the transport captains executed. 2 more transports sustained damage from near misses during these attacks, but both remained afloat and capable of continuing toward their destination. The destroyer escorts continued to demonstrate excellent tactical coordination, darting between the larger transport vessels to provide protection, laying smoke screens that obscured visibility, and firing their anti-aircraft guns in the well-practiced patterns that crews had perfected over 2 years of war. By sunset on March 2nd, the convoy was within 150 miles of Leh, close enough that men on deck claimed they could smell the distinctive scent of the jungle coastline. Confidence remained high among both the soldiers crowded on the transports and the sailors manning the escorts. They had weathered 2 days of air attacks, lost only 2 transports, and would reach their destination within hours. But in the pre-dawn darkness of March 3rd, 1943, something entirely unprecedented was taking shape on the various airfields scattered around Port Moresby. 90 aircraft of multiple types prepared for a coordinated strike operation unlike anything that had previously been attempted anywhere in the Pacific War. The plan called for B-17 flying fortresses to attack from medium altitude, not with the primary goal of sinking ships, but rather to force the convoy to break formation and scatter. A 20 Havoc light bombers would suppress anti-aircraft positions using parafrag bombs that created devastating fragmentation effects across the decks of ships. Australian bow fighters would conduct strafing runs from one direction, while the modified B-25s approached from another angle entirely, creating a deadly crossfire that would completely overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities. Every element of the attack had been carefully timed and coordinated in a way that Japanese forces had never encountered before. At precisely 10 minutes before 8 o'clock in the morning, a radar operator named Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, stationed aboard the destroyer Shikinami, reported multiple contacts approaching from the southern quadrant. These were not dozens of aircraft as previous attacks had involved, but scores of planes flying in formations that made absolutely no tactical sense according to any Japanese doctrine that Tanaka had been taught. Admiral Kimura immediately ordered the entire convoy to increase to maximum speed and initiated evasive maneuvers, but the heavily loaded transports, packed with troops and equipment far beyond their normal capacity, could barely manage 8 knots even with their engines straining. The destroyers began the process of laying smoke screens in accordance with standard defensive procedures, but there simply were not enough escort vessels to protect the entire convoy simultaneously. The smoke screens could only cover portions of the formation at any given moment. The first wave struck with absolutely devastating effect. Australian bow fighters opened fire with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns per aircraft, raking the vessels from bow to stern with continuous streams of fire. Flight Lieutenant William Newton, who would eventually win a Victoria Cross for his actions over the following days of the battle, led his bow fighter in a direct attack run at the destroyer Asashio, his cannons walking a line of explosions across her deck that killed most of the bridge crew within seconds. The Japanese forces had simply never experienced such an intense concentration of firepower delivered from aircraft. Their anti-aircraft doctrine, which had been carefully developed based on engaging high-altitude bombers that approached from above, fell apart completely when faced with fighters attacking at wave-top height from multiple directions simultaneously. Into this absolute maelstrom of fire and smoke flew Major Ed Lana's modified B-25s from the 91st Bombardment Squadron. As these aircraft approached their targets, the 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns mounted in each bomber's nose opened up simultaneously, creating a concentrated stream of destruction that swept across Japanese gun positions like some kind of giant mechanical broom. Then, at approximately 300 yards distance from their targets, the bombs released from the modified aircraft. These 500-pound bombs skipped across the water surface in the perfect trajectories that pilots had learned through weeks of dangerous practice sessions, each bomb following an arc that had been calculated through trial and error rather than mathematical formulas. The first skip bomb to successfully connect with a target was delivered by Lieutenant John Hennebury against the transport Teiyo Maru. The 500-pound bomb struck just above the waterline, penetrated through the relatively thin hull plating, and detonated deep inside the engine room. The ship's entire midsection erupted outward in a massive explosion, the blast breaking her back instantly and catastrophically. Within 90 seconds of being struck, the Teiyo Maru had completely disappeared beneath the waves, taking over 800 soldiers to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. There was no time for organised abandonment, no opportunity for most men to even reach the deck before the vessel went under. Admiral Kimura's flagship Shirayuki became the focus of an intense, concentrated attack by multiple aircraft. A skip bomb detonated against her after magazine, the ship's stored ammunition exploding and literally blowing the entire stern section off the destroyer in one massive blast. Kimura himself was wounded by machine gun fire that swept across the bridge, bullets tearing through his shoulder and penetrating his stomach as he desperately tried to coordinate some kind of defensive response from his rapidly disintegrating convoy. The flagship went down in less than 4 minutes, her crew members leaping from the steeply tilted deck into water that was already thick with spreading oil and floating bodies. The destroyer Shikinami managed to maneuver close enough to rescue Admiral Kimura and several dozen survivors before the flagship completely disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only a spreading slick of oil and debris to mark where she had been. The destruction accelerated far beyond anything that had been witnessed in any previous Pacific naval engagement. The transport Nojima Maru, attempting desperately to avoid an incoming skip-bombing run, collided directly with the already damaged destroyer Arashio, the two vessels becoming entangled with each other. Before the ships could separate and break free, 3 B-25s concentrated all of their attention on these stationary targets. Both vessels burst into flames almost simultaneously, soldiers leaping directly from the decks into water that was already covered with burning oil slicks. Captain Charles Howe, piloting B-25 number 9980, executed a devastating run against the transport Ao Maru, which was already listing heavily to one side from earlier bomb damage. His 4 skip bombs struck in perfect sequence along her waterline, each explosion opening the hull further. He circled back for a second pass, all 8 nose-mounted machine guns firing continuously, strafing the soldiers who were desperately attempting to launch lifeboats from the sinking vessel. In his official after-action report filed days later, Howe wrote with clinical military detachment about watching lifeboats overturn under the impact of his gunfire, soldiers tumbling into the sea like rag dolls. By 10:15 in the morning, just approximately 15 minutes after the main coordinated attack had begun, the convoy had completely ceased to exist as any kind of organized military force. 4 transport ships were already resting on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. 3 more transports were actively burning and sinking, with fires raging out of control and crews abandoning ship. The last transport still afloat, the Oigawa Maru, was dead in the water with her engines destroyed, surrounded by soldiers clinging desperately to whatever pieces of floating debris they could find. Of the original 8 destroyers that had provided escort, the Shirayuki had already gone down, taking Admiral Kimura's flag with her. The Arashio was burning fiercely and had been abandoned by her crew. The Tokitsukaze was listing so severely to one side that her captain had given the order to abandon ship, and the Asashio was circling aimlessly with her bridge crew dead and her rudder mechanism jammed in position. A second wave of attacking aircraft arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, finding 7 ships still technically afloat, though every single one had sustained significant damage. B-17 Flying Fortresses conducted pattern bombing from medium altitude, while B-25s made repeated strafing runs, not just against the ships, but against survivors who were swimming in the water or clinging to debris. Lieutenant Walter Krell, flying a B-25 Mitchell in this second wave of attacks, would later describe seeing the ocean surface for 20 miles in every direction covered with debris, floating life rafts, men swimming desperately, and countless dead floating face down in their kapok life vests. The scale of destruction visible from the air was unlike anything most American pilots had ever witnessed. The destroyer Tokitsukaze finally succumbed to concentrated assault during the second wave. Skip bombs from 3 different B-25s struck her simultaneously from different angles, the multiple impacts actually lifting the 2,000-ton warship partially out of the water before she broke cleanly in half. As the destroyer sank, her depth charges detonated from the water pressure, the underwater explosions killing hundreds of survivors who had been swimming nearby. The destroyer Asashio, with her steering mechanism damaged and unable to maneuver effectively, became essentially a stationary target for attacking aircraft. 4 skip bombs methodically turned her into a funeral pyre that would continue burning through the entire night before finally sinking at dawn on March 4th. The killing continued relentlessly into March 4th as American PT boats and patrolling aircraft hunted down survivors who were attempting to reach shore. Motor torpedo boat 143, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, came across a Japanese submarine that was attempting to rescue survivors from the water. In a brief but violent engagement, the PT boat's guns slaughtered soldiers who had been waiting in the water before driving off the submarine with depth charges. Captain Tameichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Shigure, which had not been part of this particular convoy, would later write extensively in his published memoirs about hearing the reports of the disaster and understanding its profound impact on Japanese naval thinking. The captain of the destroyer Yukikaze, one of only 4 escort destroyers to escape with relatively minor damage, fled northward at absolute maximum speed, with approximately 800 survivors somehow crammed onto her deck, machine gun bullets splashing in the ship's wake as American fighters made final strafing runs against the fleeing vessel. The final casualty figures defied comprehension and shattered every assumption about the relative effectiveness of land-based bombers against warships. All 8 transport vessels now rested on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. 4 destroyers had joined them in the depths. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who had been part of the convoy, only approximately 800 managed to reach Leh, while 2,427 were eventually returned to Rabaul after being rescued. The official death toll was recorded as 3,664 soldiers and sailors killed. The Americans, by stark contrast, had lost 13 aircrew members, with 1 B-17 and 3 P-38 fighters shot down during actual combat, plus 1 B-25 and 1 Beaufighter lost in accidents. The exchange ratio stunned military planners on both sides of the Pacific War, suggesting that aerial warfare had achieved capabilities that most naval theorists had not anticipated. The psychological impact on Japanese military thinking proved even more devastating than the physical losses. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, who commanded the 18th Army and had been waiting desperately for these reinforcements at Leh, received the news in stunned silence. His staff had conducted extensive wargaming exercises covering many different scenarios and contingencies, but absolutely nothing approaching the total annihilation of a strongly escorted convoy had ever been considered as a realistic possibility. The American bombers had somehow transformed from being minor annoyances that occasionally achieved lucky hits into deadly precision ship killers through innovation that seemed to violate the natural evolutionary order of military development. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters initially flatly refused to believe the reports that were coming from the South Pacific. The idea that 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers could be lost to land-based bombers without a single American surface ship being present in the battle area seemed like pure fantasy. However, the evidence proved utterly undeniable. Reconnaissance flights over the battle area in the days following found nothing but extensive oil slicks and fields of floating debris stretching for miles. The innovation that had destroyed the convoy had been born purely from desperation and had been implemented through characteristically American pragmatism. When Major Papigun had first proposed his concept of converting standard B-25 bombers into ship-killing strafers, he had possessed no formal authorization from higher headquarters, no technical manuals explaining the procedures, and no factory support whatsoever. He and his mechanics had simply started cutting away aluminum with metal shears and welding new structures into place. The skip bombing technique itself violated every standard bombardment doctrine that had been taught to pilots, requiring them to fly directly toward heavily armed enemy ships at altitudes that seemed absolutely suicidal. Yet American and Australian pilots had perfected the technique in a matter of weeks while operating under active combat conditions. For the Japanese military establishment, which remained firmly wedded to rigid doctrine and formal approval procedures, such rapid adaptation to changing circumstances was literally incomprehensible. Their bomber aircraft remained configured exactly as they had been originally designed at the factories, their tactics unchanged from what pilots had been taught during pre-war training exercises. A Japanese pilot who took it upon himself to modify his aircraft without formal authorization from multiple levels of command would face immediate court-martial. An American pilot who improved his bomber's combat effectiveness through field modifications received a medal and public recognition. The consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea rippled throughout the entire course of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders could no longer risk committing surface convoys within the operational range of Allied airbases, which effectively isolated their scattered garrisons throughout the region. Supplies had to be moved exclusively by submarine or through fast destroyer runs conducted under cover of darkness, reducing the entire logistics system to a mere trickle of what was actually needed. The garrison at Leh never recovered from the loss of reinforcements. When Australian forces eventually attacked the position months later, they encountered defenders who had been severely weakened by tropical disease, chronic malnutrition, and ammunition shortages that could be traced directly back to the convoy's destruction. Admiral Kimura, while recovering from his multiple wounds in the hospital at Rabaul, submitted an extensive after-action report that fundamentally challenged basic assumptions about modern naval warfare. Aircraft, he argued with the conviction of painful experience, had rendered traditional surface escorts essentially obsolete when those escorts were operating within range of concentrated enemy air power. The concentration of forward-firing firepower achieved by the modified American bombers exceeded anything that destroyer anti-aircraft systems could effectively counter. His detailed recommendations for convoy protection procedures were eventually implemented, but far too late to affect the outcome of campaigns already in progress. The technical details of American innovations eventually reached Japanese intelligence services through various channels, creating reactions that combined both professional admiration and deep despair among Japanese planners. The forward-firing guns that had been installed on the B-25 bombers required absolutely no new technology whatsoever, just the imagination to use existing weapons in fundamentally different ways. Skip bombing relied on basic physics principles that had been understood since childhood. Yet the Japanese military system, with its overwhelming emphasis on achieving perfection and adhering to orthodoxy, could never have possibly produced such innovations within its rigid cultural framework. In the broader strategic context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked an absolutely fundamental shift in the balance of power. Air superiority, and specifically the innovative application of air power in ways that violated established doctrine, had definitively trumped traditional sea power in ways that most naval theorists simply had not anticipated. The Americans had demonstrated a capacity for rapid innovation under field conditions that would characterize the remainder of their war effort. General Douglas MacArthur proclaimed the battle as one of the most complete and annihilating combat victories of all time. General George Kenney celebrated what he saw as vindication of his tactical theories, immediately ordering that more bombers be modified according to the same specifications and that more pilots receive training in skip bombing techniques. Within a matter of months, skip bombing had evolved from being an experimental technique to becoming standard operational procedure throughout the entire Pacific theater. For the Japanese High Command, the disaster prompted a complete re-evaluation of their strategic approach throughout the Southwest Pacific. The decision to effectively abandon all future surface reinforcement of New Guinea bases meant that they were essentially ceding the initiative to Allied forces. From March 1943 onward, Japanese forces throughout the entire region fought an increasingly desperate defensive battle, completely unable to receive significant reinforcements, while Allied strength continued to grow exponentially month after month. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond the cold statistics recorded in official reports. Thousands of Japanese families eventually received formal notification that their sons were missing in action, with bodies never recovered from the depths of the Bismarck Sea. Letters that were found floating among the debris revealed the hopes, fears, and mundane concerns of young soldiers who had placed their complete trust in their Navy's ability to provide protection. Among the American air crews who had participated in the battle, the experience produced remarkably complex feelings that many struggled with for years afterward. Many pilots who had conducted strafing runs against helpless survivors in the water struggled psychologically with what they had done, even while intellectually understanding the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore to fight again. Lieutenant Walter Krell suffered persistent nightmares for years following the battle, haunted by vivid mental images of men swimming desperately away from his approaching bomber while his machine guns systematically killed them. The tactical innovations demonstrated at the Bismarck Sea spread with remarkable speed throughout all Allied forces operating in the Pacific. Skip bombing proved devastatingly effective against virtually all types of Japanese vessels, from small coastal barges all the way up to heavy cruisers. By the war's end, hundreds of Japanese vessels had fallen victim to these same types of attacks, with crews learning to fear the distinctive engine drone of Mitchell bombers flying just barely above the wave tops. The battle also demonstrated the absolutely critical importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare. Allied codebreakers had provided not merely general warning that a convoy was coming, but precise details about composition, route, and timing that allowed optimal positioning of striking forces. This intelligence advantage, when combined with tactical innovation and aggressive execution, had created essentially perfect conditions for the complete destruction of the convoy. For military historians examining the evolution of air power, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represents an absolutely critical watershed moment. Traditional naval vessels, regardless of how well armed they were or how skillfully they were handled by their crews, had proven catastrophically vulnerable to concentrated air attacks employing innovative tactics that defensive systems had not been designed to counter. The age-old concept of surface naval dominance now faced an existential threat from land-based aircraft capable of striking hundreds of miles from their bases. The technological simplicity of the American innovations made them particularly significant from a doctrinal perspective. These modifications involved no sophisticated radar systems, no guided weapons, no jet engines, just existing technology that was applied in fundamentally different ways. Machine guns were moved from defensive to offensive mounting positions. Standard bombs were employed in unconventional delivery profiles. Medium bombers designed for level bombing were instead used as low-altitude attack aircraft. None of these innovations required any kind of scientific breakthrough. They simply required imagination combined with the courage to test dangerous new concepts under combat conditions. Japanese survivors of the battle consistently spoke about their complete shock at the overwhelming firepower and unexpected tactics employed by American forces. Seaman Yukio Tanaka, who was rescued by the destroyer Yukikaze after the transport Teiyo Maru exploded beneath him, described the attacking B-25s as appearing like demons from mythology, with nose guns that seemed to breathe continuous streams of fire, while bombs skipped across the water like stones thrown by giants. The coordination of attacks from multiple different altitudes had created a kind of sensory overload that completely paralyzed effective decision-making among Japanese commanders trying to organize defensive responses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, studied the detailed battle reports with growing pessimism about Japan's long-term prospects. He had famously predicted before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to perhaps a year before American industrial might inevitably shifted the balance of power. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea provided concrete proof that American innovation could dramatically accelerate that predicted timeline. The battle demonstrated that American advantages extended well beyond simple material superiority, that their cultural flexibility and institutional willingness to experiment were providing tactical advantages that no amount of Japanese courage or fighting spirit could possibly overcome. The battle influenced post-war military doctrine development in profound ways that extended far beyond just the immediate Pacific context. The United States Air Force, which was established as an independent service branch in 1947, repeatedly cited the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as historical validation of strategic air power theory. Naval planners across multiple nations recognized the demonstrated vulnerability of surface vessels to determined air attack, which significantly accelerated the development of surface-to-air missile systems and sophisticated radar-controlled anti-aircraft systems. The strategic implications of the battle extended throughout the entire Pacific theater of operations. Japanese bases scattered throughout the Solomon Islands could no longer reasonably expect to receive reinforcement by sea. The massive garrison at Rabaul became increasingly isolated despite its strategic importance. Operation Cartwheel, General MacArthur's extensive campaign designed to isolate Rabaul without having to conduct a costly direct assault, succeeded in large part because Japanese forces simply could not risk major convoy operations after witnessing what had happened in the Bismarck Sea. Within Japan itself, accurate news about the disaster was completely suppressed from public knowledge, with official reports describing only minor losses during what was claimed as a successful reinforcement operation. The true scale of the catastrophe remained hidden from the Japanese public until after the war ended, when American occupation forces discovered Japanese military records detailing the full extent of the disaster. Many families never learned the specific fate of their loved ones, never discovered whether they had been killed by bombs, bullets, or had drowned in the oil-choked waters of the Bismarck Sea. The evolution of skip bombing techniques continued steadily throughout the remainder of the war, with procedures being continuously refined based on accumulated combat experience. Delayed action fuses were perfected to ensure that bombs penetrated deep into target vessels before detonating, maximizing internal damage. By 1945, skip bombing had become so thoroughly routine that newly trained pilots arriving in theatre considered it completely standard procedure, entirely unaware of the revolutionary origins of the technique in desperate improvisations conducted during 1943. For Admiral Kimura, who survived the war despite his serious wounds, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea remained the defining moment of his entire military career. In post-war interviews conducted by historians, he consistently praised American innovation and adaptability, while simultaneously lamenting Japanese institutional inflexibility. The same destroyer tactics that had succeeded brilliantly in the Solomons campaign had proven completely inadequate against modified bombers attacking from wave-top height. The physical wreckage of the convoy still lies scattered across the floor of the Bismarck Sea, an underwater graveyard providing silent testimony to the devastating effectiveness of American tactical innovation. Modern sonar surveys have successfully located most of the wrecks, with their positions corresponding closely to contemporary action reports filed by attacking pilots. These wrecks now serve as official war graves, protected under international law with exploration heavily restricted out of respect for the dead who still rest within the hulls. The technical reports that were meticulously filed after the battle provided detailed blueprints that would guide future operations throughout the Pacific. What had begun as desperate improvisation rapidly became established military science, taught systematically in classrooms and practiced extensively on training ranges. The complete innovation cycle from initial invention through standardization and widespread implementation took less than 6 months, demonstrating the US military's remarkable capacity for institutional learning. Japanese naval doctrine never fully recovered from the psychological impact of the Bismarck Sea disaster. All subsequent operations increasingly relied on submarines for cargo transport and high-speed destroyer runs conducted exclusively at night, tactics that could deliver only small fractions of the supplies that ground forces desperately needed. The inability to protect surface convoys during daylight hours essentially meant ceding complete control of the seas to Allied forces whenever the sun was up. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been specifically designed and trained for decisive surface fleet engagements, found itself increasingly reduced to skulking operations conducted under cover of darkness. In military academies around the world, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea continues to be studied extensively as a classic example of how operational innovation can decisively defeat tactical superiority. Japanese destroyer captains during the battle had executed their assigned tactics essentially flawlessly. Individual crews had performed with tremendous courage under horrific conditions. Equipment had functioned exactly as it had been designed to function. Yet, despite all of this, they were systematically annihilated by an enemy force that had fundamentally changed the very nature of the engagement itself. Modern naval forces operating today have thoroughly internalized these lessons, developing elaborately layered air defense systems that would have seemed like pure science fiction to sailors in 1943. Yet the fundamental lesson remains eternally relevant. Innovation in tactics and procedures can overcome superiority in technology and numbers. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as permanent testament to the power of innovation over hidebound tradition, flexibility over rigid thinking, and rapid adaptation over adherence to established doctrine. In just 15 minutes of coordinated attack action on the morning of March 3, 1943, American and Australian air crews succeeded in destroying not merely a Japanese military convoy, but an entire conception of how naval warfare would function in the modern era. Skip bombing, which had been developed through genuinely dangerous experimentation by pilots risking their lives, achieved what 2 full years of conventional high-altitude bombing had utterly failed to accomplish. For the Japanese soldiers who perished in those tropical waters, the battle represented a tragedy of misplaced trust in traditional concepts of naval power. Their deaths provided brutal proof of the fallacy underlying all of their assumptions. The waters of the Bismarck Sea became their permanent grave, their sacrifice ultimately rendered meaningless as Japan's entire strategic position in New Guinea collapsed progressively without the reinforcements they had been meant to provide. The convoy that had departed Rabaul on February 28, 1943, had carried far more than simply soldiers and military supplies in its holds. It had carried the last realistic hopes of maintaining Japanese territorial expansion throughout the Southwest Pacific region. Its complete destruction proved definitively that the fundamental nature of warfare had undergone a revolutionary change, that air power, when properly employed, could decisively neutralize traditional sea power, and that institutional capacity for innovation could triumph over adherence to tradition. The men who died were ultimately victims not simply of American bombs and bullets, but of their own military system's profound inability to adapt rapidly enough to changing battlefield reality. The waters of the Bismarck Sea have long since cleared of oil and debris. The wrecks have gradually become coral-encrusted monuments, serving as final resting places for the dead. But the lessons written in blood during March 1943 endure with undiminished relevance. Innovation matters more fundamentally than tradition. Flexibility in thinking defeats rigid adherence to doctrine. These truths, purchased at terrible cost, remain profoundly relevant to every military organization facing the eternal tension between established practice and revolutionary thinking. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was far more than simply a military victory for Allied forces. It represented a genuine triumph of innovative thinking whose implications and lessons resonate far beyond its specific historical moment, continuing to influence military doctrine and strategic thinking even into the present day.